The Iliad, Book 1, The Quarrel. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, which caused the Greeks immeasurable pain and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades, and made men the spoils of dogs, a banquet for the birds, and so the plan of Zeus unfolded, starting with the conflict between great Agamemnon, lord of men, and glorious Achilles.
Hello, everyone. Oh my God, Niamh speaking first this week. Ava, how are you?
Oh my God, I get to be first again, always. Yay. I'm good. I'm doing well. I accidentally fell asleep at like 9 p.m. last night, so that was outstanding.
Yeah.
It was very much giving on the seventh day God rested. I just needed to take a day or so, or just get a nice 11 hours of sleep. I had an audition this morning. It went quite well. Made a nice lunch with veggies. Hello. I tried to leave my apartment as little as possible today because here in Miss Chicago this morning it feels like -4. So I left my apartment once today, and I'm happy with that. Yeah, but altogether, I'm doing okay. I have mainly just been kind of chugging along with work and other not like smaller projects, but just different projects recently. Sending in auditions and going to the gym. Although my gym, a pipe burst in the building next door. We found that out 2 days ago when we tried to go, and there was a sign taped to the door. And they were like, you can go to either of these other locations. And I was like, that's far away. So I'm hoping that gets fixed soon. But yeah, just kind of a lot of the regular stuff, but still chilling with it, happy with it, doing all right. How are you, Brayden?
I'm good. It's weird to go second in this order. This is crazy. I'm good. I'm enjoyed President's Day off. I had a nice like slow weekend in between a couple like busy weekends. I also had like a crazy week at work last week, so I like really it was like this weekend I'm not going to do much but the like take care of myself stuff because again, as I've been on this year, that's my like mental health journey of like taking care of myself and all that jazz. I played Marvel Rivals for a while today. I went to the gym and then I played Marvel Rivals with my brother. So that was fun. For those of you who are curious, I am of course a Loki main. Surprise to no one.
Yeah.
I also heavy on magic as well. We love Ileana Rasputin. But yeah, other than that, I'm chilling. I'm thriving. Really busy doing a bunch of different projects, including the project that we're gonna talk about today. But before we get into that, Niamh Sherlock, mistress of ceremonies for today. How are you?
I'm doing well. I forgot today was a holiday, President's Day, because I went to work and then I went to the gym and there were 900,000 people there. I was like, oh my God, I have never seen more human beings in a space before. All working out at the same time. It was literally like every single treadmill was full. And like, I go to a nice gym now with a lot of machines. So I was like, why are all of these full? Like, this is so crazy. Like, I pay more now. Why are all the machines full? But it was still good. I like had to like basically eye down some gym bros for machines as they became available. Like like mental wars with people like, I'm going to do this machine next and you will wait a second. But yeah, I'm doing good. Otherwise, I had quite a busy weekend of being an actor, so that's fun. Um yeah, uh, doing well overall. And for those of you wondering why I'm taking the helm this episode and thinking, oh my God, who would ever let her do that? I will be for our little Between Books episode this week, we decided not to watch a movie because we are synergizing with the theater company that we're all involved with, Next Life Theater Company, who is doing an adaptation this summer of the Iliad, which is a little bit connected to this podcast about Greek mythology and Percy Jackson. So today I'm going to be leading the conversation with Brayden and Ava, who co-adapted this script. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk about it with you guys and hear you say what I've already heard you say, but in a more extended way. And it'll also be really great for me as the marketing director of this theater company to just talk about the themes of the show so I can better design stuff. So we're really killing a lot of birds with one stone here. And we'll also be talking about like the themes of the Iliad for those who don't just want to hear all about theater. Although if you're listening to this, why?
Yeah.
We talk about theater a lot, even in our regular episodes. So yeah, exciting stuff. So I know we normally do a summary. I feel like it's cruel to have anyone do it in 30 seconds. So do we just want to summarize without the time pressure on it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like sounds good. I mean, I don't even know where to start with this.
Exactly.
But maybe how about I take like the first half and then Ava, you pick it up.
Sure.
Here, you know what we can do? We can do a minute summary. I'll do 30 seconds, and then Ava will finish with the rest, the other 30 seconds that I don't get to.
Okay, that's great. Love it.
A nice share the wealth. There are what, 24 books?
Yep.
In the Iliad. 12 and 12, baby. Like go for it. What happens? What happens in the Iliad? Niamh, let us know when we're on the clock.
All right. 3, 2, 1, go.
All right, so we're by the ships. We're quarreling. Agamemnon steals Briseis from Achilles, and Achilles goes, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to deal with this. There's also a plague at a certain point. Then Achilles sits out a lot of war. There's a bunch that happens in Troy. They do like 2 invasions. One works, one doesn't. And then they like go like, please, Achilles, come back. And then they start to fire on the ships, and the ships are on fire.
Ava, pick it up.
Okay, and so essentially, we're going to skip forward a lot. Achilles is in love with another soldier named Patroclus. They're both boys. It's awesome. And basically, Patroclus gets like super kind of like worried that Achilles is in combat a lot because he's like the Greek guy. Like everyone's using him as like the weapon and the soldier and everything. Patroclus is like, I could wear your clothes so you don't get hurt. And Patroclus gets slain. And then Achilles gets really fucking angry and then kills Hector. And then Achilles eventually dies too. It's just a whole shit show. And then Troy goes down.
Yes, it does.
Oh boy, was that hard to do.
No, holy
bet.
I like that, Ava, you included like post-Iliad events.
Oh, because we're talking about it here. I had to.
That's true. We're this episode we're talking about it's an episode about quote unquote the Iliad. We're talking about the whole idea of this overall. If you think we've been annoying about classics and literature this entire time, this is about to be us at our worst. Yeah, I got real caught up in the weeds.
I get it.
So much happens. So much happens in this Iliad.
Like notably.
I know.
And notably. And like it's all important, and as a holistic work of literature, I love it. Yeah. We did not adapt the whole Iliad, but we've focused on very specifically, like our production is Achilles is the title of the show that we adapted, and it's the Achilles parts of this. But oh boy, are there a lot of parts of the Iliad that Achilles isn't involved in, because the Iliad is about 2 people. It's about Hector and Achilles, and Hector gets up to a lot.
It hurt me not to talk
shenanigans.
about little Trojans. It hurt me not to even say Hecuba's name.
Real, yeah. There's so going on. The Trojan women, That's a whole other play.
I'm gonna throw up everywhere. Don't even let me talk about it.
Yeah, we gotta stay on
Okay, we'll stay locked in to our to our plan today. So, we've already talked a little bit about it, but do you want to talk about the development process for the specific adaptation that Next Life is doing of the Achilles parts of this very, very long book?
Get in there, Brayden. Yeah.
Yeah, like, okay, yeah. I'll start because I had the idea for this. Um, my like initial impetus behind this entire project was I'm having a hard time narrowing it down to like synthesize into one specific thing. But I started thinking about this a long time ago, reading the Song of Achilles. This is our adaptation takes us in a completely different direction. There was a completely different draft of this entire project that I first proposed this to our company with, that was really different and much more depressing, more like the Luca Guadagnino version of the Iliad, for lack of a better word. That was a lot more in step with a lot of the themes that Song of Achilles draws on, from the Iliad. And then I wrote that adaptation, and then I did another reread of the Iliad, and then I went, "Girl, that's like not what I'm interested in the story at all." Because like there's a lot of stuff like with like queer romance and like that. I really like that aspect of the Iliad and adaptations of it. But I was like, that's, I guess I'm not interested in telling a story about it. Is kind of where I ended up, and so I really got into the headspace of Achilles, especially as politics began to take the direction that they've taken recently. And we're hearing a lot more rhetoric that sounds a lot more like the don't ask, don't tell period of American politics and queer politics of history. And so I just kind of ended up in this space about how the military uses the people who work for it, soldiers, when what that positionality and that intersectionality of being a body and a person and also a weapon. um and that kind of became the new into this story, and it ended up taking it off in a completely different direction. Achilles and Patroclus are core part of this story, but the romance is more incidental to the narrative, like it is in the original Iliad. Like, it's, I think the adaptation that we developed is a lot more in step with a lot of the tradition of the Iliad. And then I brought Ava on to work with this with me, and I think Ava can talk more about her personal ins, and what she found in the script.
Yeah. I mean, so initially, okay. Wow, great start. I function essentially at the moment as this company's resident dramaturg, or dramaturge, however the hell you want to pronounce it, with gender and everything. Largely because I am remote for the most part. I am famously living approximately 700 miles away from these people, some of my closest friends in the world. But we all were very dedicated to the idea of everyone who wanted to be involved being involved. And so that was the position I held during our previous production of Carmilla. I took more of a backseat. I did some program notes. I did some like packets and displays and like, you know, smaller, more textual things. But when Brayden asked if I wanted to help edit and help adapt, I was like, oh hell yeah. I don't think of myself as someone who is like a writer first necessarily, because it was never a concentration I had like in my major or blah, blah, blah. But writing more analytically has always been something that I'm very passionate about, and words themselves. I'm a total linguistics freak and a grammar freak. And altogether, I love the idea of being an editor or an adapter of something, especially because I have so many feelings about who adapts what and how and what that means. And yeah, essentially, as we went through, we workshopped a couple drafts. We left comments. We made little edits and adaptations, like drafts for one another. We synthesized them. And we were able to put together a reading on Zoom with both like a cast of people we knew and also some observers whose perspectives we really wanted, people we'd worked with before in the industry or just trusted friends, mentors, etc. And that was kind of the biggest next step in the process. And from there, we were able to kind of hone in on what questions they were asking, what directions we wanted those questions to point us in terms of the final product, how we wanted to make those more final edits. And now here we are. We're almost ready to start casting and start putting the show on its feet. Yeah, I mean, it's overall just very exciting. It's been kind of a whirlwind, but yeah.
Yes, so exciting. Yeah, I actually wanted to see if you guys want to talk about a little more like whose adaptation of the Iliad you're using for this show, and like how that matters to you, and like what, because you know the Iliad's been translated in a whole bunch of different ways, and different people have been at the helm of like how people have read this story. So if you want to talk quickly about that before we move on to our next topic of like whose translation we're using.
Well, I off the bat, I would like to clarify that we're using a public domain translation
Yes.
of Iliad, but we are using a lot of the concepts and a approach to the text inspired by Emily Wilson, who is one of the few women to have ever published a translation of the Iliad. I have my copy of Emily Wilson Iliad and Emily Wilson The Odyssey right here. They sit on my desk along with a copy of the Oresteia that Ava got me for Christmas, actually. Those are on my desk, as well as my journals of notes for this show. Because I surrounded myself by this stuff. But Ava, I don't know if you want to talk more about Emily Wilson as a translator and how that influenced us.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, like, she is one of, at least from my perspective, and I didn't major in classics or any of this stuff. I just kind of love it a lot. From my perspective, Emily Wilson is kind of the forefront. Like, I don't know. She is the woman translator that I think people know most. And, on that, like going down that pathway, she has also proven herself to be reliable in that, like, she has translated many different things. Like, I can compare her almost to, these are men, but the other translators I know that are as kind of reliable and have an expansive canon like she does are like Robert Graves, Robert Fagles, et cetera, et cetera. I will say, though, that Emily Wilson, while being one of my favorite translators, is not my favorite. My favorite translator of all time is poet extraordinaire Ted Hughes. He, unfortunately, though, does not have a translation of the Iliad and died before he could, in theory, write one. So I have read his translations of Oedipus, have read his translation of the Oresteia, and that's kind of like a language sort of inspiration for me, like how he puts emotions and ideas into words that aren't necessarily so cut and dry. I think with a lot of translators, we kind of deal with the idea of like, and I said this to him, and the tree waved in the wind, and I walked over there, which isn't necessarily as compelling as some like modern theatrical literature we have. But with Ted Hughes, you know, his voice kind of being in the back of my mind, I think that's how we were able to take Emily Wilson's foundation almost of like how she tells these stories and apply, at least for me, kind of this like metatextual, let's talk about more than just the physical things here, lens to it.
Because in a lot of ways, too, our piece becomes its we are maintaining a lot of the text of the Iliad that serves as the dialogue to the piece, but we have the kind of editing we've done to it is significant enough that it's kind of its own translation in the end. So it has become an amalgamation of a lot of different people's work on this text that we don't even really know who was written by, because it's attributed to Homer, but it was orally told. Homer is people's best guess at if it was told by one guy, who it might be. But like the Iliad, even as it was being retold, because it was told orally, people change things. The specific wording is always completely different. The like big story beats are always there. There's no version of the Iliad where like Hector doesn't die or Patroclus doesn't die. Like all of the big moments are still there, but the way that they're talked about and approached are different every time the story is told. And so like that also, that is a core tenet, I think, in the way that Ava and I approached this text.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a pretty good transition into my next question, because when we were in theater school, a big question was, why this play now? And it was meant to be like, why in this modern day does this story need to be told? Which I think is like a question that weighs even heavier when you are retelling an older, especially a classic. Like, why are you bringing this back to? What are you trying to comment on? So I think we kind of already got into it, but like starting on like the political context of this show and the political context of the Iliad and how they're going to say something about right now, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of feelings about.
We can start with like, what's a good theme to start? We can start with just zoning in on the military themes, I think.
Sure. Fundamentally, you all have heard me talk a lot about how I think that we should always do classics, because those people that were written about, or even like the mythological figures, are just us in a different font. They are metaphorically like our ancestors. They did the same stuff we do now, fundamentally. And we would be remiss if we didn't find those connections, because we can only learn more about ourselves and them through that. And so kind of through that lens, our minds kind of in a way just did this concept speak for the both of us, immediately went to the like gross parallels with the stakes of the Trojan War and the stakes of the current state of the union. And fundamentally for me, what it boils down to is this moment in time, these past, I would say 8-ish to 9 years, have very much felt like the end of days, more than I think has happened in recent history. And I think the exact same goes with the Trojan War. I even have written down, I brought notes, living in a time where it has never felt like the world was ending more, even being acutely aware of relatively similar violence in history. Like, sure, Ronald Reagan brought a whole different era of violence in, and it was the end of days for many people. This era almost feels more apocalyptic and less specific than Reagan. And for example, like collapses of previous empires, like before the Bronze Age, famously were learned about because humanities were so important in education then, and in that kind of general region that we know of, at least. But there's a reason why the Iliad is one of the like longest standing and most impactful pieces of literature that we have from this time, because the stakes were so ridiculously high for life and for the world, even in theory, continuing to exist. And so I think that is immediately the parallel that I drew. I have some smaller, funnier parallels like Cassandra and Bernie Sanders. I could go on that tangent if y'all want me to later. But fundamentally, it is kind of this like, how do you protect and deal with humanity in like the end of days?
Mm-hmm. I think like that sets up what I wanted to talk about so perfectly, which is it doesn't quite immediately answer your military question, but I promise it's getting there. Which
Girl, we
is
got time.
The late Bronze Age collapse, which is one of my personal historical niche interests, but also most importantly the historical context for the Iliad. The Iliad was written in the Greek Dark Ages, written quote unquote by Homer, was told and retold, and is dated back to the Dark Ages, set in the late Bronze Ages, leading up to the Bronze Age collapse. That is due to a lot of factors that the Bronze Age collapsed, and a lot of those factors and a lot of that global politics of the time, to me, are very reflective of now. I have studies I could point you towards on this, but I'm not going to bore everyone too much in this already very technical, heady, like kind of conversation about classics. But the thesis is the reason that the Bronze Age collapse was so devastating was because of the interconnectedness of the economies of the city states and empires and ruling powers of that time. All of for the context of what the Bronze Age looked like is power concentrated in cities. The idea of a country as we know it today wasn't the same, because you have towns and cities and territories, and you have identities that are shaped by like more like what we think of as an empire. The Greeks, as they appear in the Iliad, are not a unified country in the way that we think about Greece today. They are a collection of unified cities and under kings that fall in a structure more of the like Macedonian empire, and that idea of Greece at the time is really different than it is now. But and Troy is essentially the capital city, quote unquote, of the Hittite Empire. Not the capital city, because again, that's incorrectly placing modern context onto historical moments. But it is a major city and a major, more importantly, port city, a major center of trade, because it is at the Hellespont, which is the stretch of water that connects the Aegean and the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. So it's a huge area for trade. And so, and you think about at the same time, the other major empires are like, I mean, Egypt is where the concentration of most power is at the time. All of these Mediterranean and what we now consider the Middle East, this entire structure was really interconnected through trade and politics and war, but most importantly, it's very similar to today's economy in the globalization of trade and their economy. So basically, when one city collapses, the entire structure fails. There are a lot of interconnected systems due to the trade at the time that set everything up to easily crumble. We don't know why the Bronze Age's collapse happened. We have a lot of theories, but the biggest result of the Bronze Age collapse was the fact that we lost literacy, because essentially, like Troy in this story, like they burned the cities down. There were already literacy is already not super prevalent in these spaces. The Iliad does not have a lot of people writing. There are maybe like 2 references to written word in the Iliad. But bookkeeping is where literacy exists, and all of that bookkeeping is destroyed. Which was my really long roundabout way of like info dumping a bunch of history on everyone. To explain that like that is the economy that we exist in today. And we're and like stressing myself out now thinking about it because all of Trump's tariffs and things like this. The economy of the planet is so incredibly globalized and interconnected that Trump being elected in America has massive impact on the global economy. That is very new. That has never existed before the 20th century, and formed during the 20th century. The biggest turning point, I'm about to get to the point about the military. The biggest turning point for the globalization of the world's economy happens in the 90s and early 2000s under the Clinton and Bush administrations. Of course, a lot of that was built up through World War I, World War II, the Cold War. But the end of the Cold War is the solidification of America as the major superpower in the world. And that's what set the global economy to be based on the health of America's economy. Obviously, Russia, China, India, there are plenty of other countries doing this, but up until that point, the British Empire was where a lot of the economy rested. Our adaptation of the Iliad is heavily based in the contemporaneously the late 90s, early 2000s, in the Clinton Bush era of politics, because that is where the path that we're on now, which is a lot closer to the actual collapse, places us. So it's kind of it's a little bit anachronistic, but it is being set slightly before our current time period in the way that the Iliad is set slightly before the Bronze Age collapse, as a look at the beginnings of failing of an empire, specifically with a foundation in military conquest into the Middle East.
Yeah.
I'm going to let other people talk for a little bit now.
And honestly,
no, that was great. That was so great.
You made points that I really want to jump off of. So essentially, the fact that the Trojan War is referred to as kind of like the quote unquote revenge of the Mycenaeans. So like this powerhouse Greek city-state polis, I think in my eyes, at least, my sort of somewhat theory that I have synthesized from reading a lot of like analysis of this is that they didn't know they didn't understand how Mycenae had that much power. The only way to explain that was through starting this war through a human having an interaction with some gods. Now, how the hell does the US have this much power? Right. If you were a powerhouse nation, faced with opposition also that has 1,000,000 allies, because Troy has a lot more allies than Mycenae does. Troy has allies like, I'm about to do a visual. That's not going to work. But like northwest, those city-states there of Troy were all allies of the Trojans. If you're a powerhouse nation, though, like Mycenae, faced with opposition that has 1,000,000 allies, and you still destroy your opposition after decades, or I guess in the Trojan Wars timeline, like a little over a decade, you will only destroy yourself after that. Because you, the singular nation, the singular powerhouse nation, with this like crazy strength that can only kind of be attributed to gods or like cosmic intervention, are lacking a fundamental understanding of the globalization of the economy. Like that's kind of the whole thing. Like it arguably started because one guy had beef with gods. It's never been about the people. No one even wanted this. Like nations that operate through figureheads versus nations that operate through citizens and democracy. Because the US is certainly not one, and Mycenae did not seem to be one either. Because Agamemnon was, if anything, a tyrant. And I think kind of as like a little PS, that's another thing we have to examine when like telling any story about the Trojan War, that this is Greek memory. This is not Trojan memory, because there is no Trojan memory of this war.
Also, this war may or may not have happened.
True.
To stress that like there's a historical site that we attribute to the location of Troy. There are about 9, I think, don't quote me on that, layers of city. I think the 6th layer of that in this basically hill is what we can date to being around the time that the Trojan War would have happened. So we have enough information to believe that there was a war between what was the Mycenaean Greeks, and I also said Macedonian earlier, and I've been thinking about that this entire
I knew what you meant.
but there was a war between the
We're gonna put a bunch of alarms in the edit when you're about to say it.
I know. But there was a war between what we assume to be the Mycenaean Greeks and the location of Ilion. Because also in the Iliad, we're referring to not Greece and Troy, but Ilion and Achaia. I don't know. I'm not pronouncing that right. It's more like Achaia, but that feels so awkward to say.
Yeah.
But Ilion is so much like so elegant.
Yeah.
But so there was some sort of war, but this is also again like this is a in a lot of ways a patriotic narrative that is told throughout the dark ages of Greece, leading up to the foundation of democracy in Greece. But these are some of the intact stories that remain. The Iliad and the Odyssey are part of a much larger cultural practice surrounded in telling the story of the Trojan War. A lot of the big things like Achilles and his heel, we don't have the text of the Achilles anymore. The Iliad and the Odyssey are 2 parts of a much larger cycle of storytelling that is more even preserved later in democratic Greece by people like Aeschylus and Euripides telling other stories of mostly of like things like Iphigenia and Agamemnon and the Oresteia that highlight the before and after, but we don't really have a lot of the other content of the beginning of the actual war and the like actual end of the war, we have this mostly this weird middle bit of like the first couple months of the last year, and then the Odyssey picks up after the war is over, and these are our two like major oldest historical texts around the story.
Oh, it's just crazy to think about that. Like, you need to take a moment to be like, damn, that is so insane. But I think like hearing whatever like this adaptation being placed in the like early 2000s, late 90s era of politics, and it makes like I think a big show like question that the show asks, and like question that can be asked today is like in terms of military service, like what you're fighting for, and how back then it was so like you're really fighting for foreign interests, and like now today when we think of like how this the 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 end of days, as Abe was saying before, that like might not happen. We're we never know, but like that idea of a empire pulling in and focusing so much on itself, and we see like the literal recent cuts to USAID and stuff, like the idea that like we should not be focusing on any global relations anymore, and we should only be like the America First narrative, I think is going to be a really interesting environment to put up this show in. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, because to talk further about the current Trumpness of it all, because it's the interesting about the development of this piece is our first draft of this happened pre-election. Our second draft of it happened right as the election was happening, and our most recent draft we just finished kind of at the beginning, like the first week of Trump's inauguration. So like this piece has developed and only become more relevant as politics has progressed. But the idea of patriotism and nationhood within and without the military currently as an American is a huge question. When you are told to fight for a government, to believe in a government, to believe in a nation that doesn't believe in you, is the fundamental question of this piece that we're asking. The original sin of the Iliad is Achilles being disrespected by the leader that he is following. And he sits out most of the war because not most of the war, but most of the fighting in the first half of the Iliad, because he is not valued by his government. He then loses Patroclus, and in that personal turn of events, he decides to fight for his government, not because he believes in what they're saying or that they value him, but because of now his personal stake in it. And now he has to grapple with his rage and grief and what that means. And by the end of the Iliad, and our adaptation of it, he has to learn to forgive not only himself but his enemy, but never really learns to forgive the system that he is fighting for. He never he doesn't turn to believe in what he's fighting for.
Yeah. No, because fundamentally, like, we see this with both Agamemnon's rule and Trump's rule / situation / frankly Clinton's too. A figurehead will get us into a situation, us meaning the greater citizen body, that we didn't ask for. And the only reason that the citizen body, at least from my perspective, would be at all compelled to take action, like violence speaking, like militarily, is for the other citizens that are being affected in it. It's never about the figurehead that got us into this whole thing. And I think kind of midway through the conflict, like the citizen body remembers that and kind of realizes, like, this is why you question authority, because the authority is what got us into a situation that none of us asked for, that isn't hurting them is only hurting us, and that we're only engaging in because it's hurting people that we care about.
Yeah. And that's the don't ask, don't tell question as
Right.
well. And that's why that was a huge in for us with this piece is what does it mean for your government to say, I don't value you, your identity, who you love, what your position is as a person, but I do value what you're able to offer me as a body and as a weapon. Achilles is the greatest weapon in the Greeks' arsenal. He is the son of Zeus. He is a demigod. He's invulnerable. Besides his heel, spoilers, T. um, but he is essentially a nuke.
Yeah.
But he's also a person, and then their devaluing of him puts them in a bad position, and then that's the conflict of the whole entire piece is when do you take the nuclear option when you have to also treat it as a person, and like that's a really complicated question, like what value do our bodies have to our government beyond our identity and within our identity.
Oh, word. Yeah, I think like that's a good transition into like there's never going to be any separation of the political and personal themes of this adaptation and of the Iliad, frankly. But like I think it's a good transition into the idea of like of grief and rage and like what you're those are two big themes when because this show really examines like Achilles as a person and his personal relationships, and the war is just sort of the setting, if that, so I think if either of you want to talk more about like what his personal relationships with like Patroclus and like the other characters that are surrounding him while he decides whether or not he wants to partake in this.
I mean, I can't attribute this quote to myself. I don't remember. I've consumed so much content and like done so much research around this project that I wish I remember who said this, what theorist said this, but the Iliad is not the story of Achilles. It doesn't start with his birth. It doesn't start with his backstory. We don't talk about how he was born and stuff. The entire context for this is set by the wedding of his parents. So he is innately part of the story from the beginning, but we're not talking about him being dipped in the river Styx. And we're not talking about like I mean there's so many interesting things about Achilles' story and like his time in Skyros, and he disguises himself as a woman to avoid the draft. What does that mean with the current transgender ban in the military? There's a neat story of transness and gender identity within Achilles' story too. That's not in the Iliad. That's a separate part of his story, but like it certainly informs this. But that all happens way before the Iliad happens. 7 years of war happens before the Iliad starts. Achilles doesn't die in the Iliad either. It doesn't end with his death. It is the story of Achilles' rage. The inciting incident of the story is this betrayal in the text, the original text. It is the repossession of Briseis. Briseis isn't in our adaptation. Our like betrayal is more vague and theoretical. But because we wanted to make it more about the don't ask don't tell idea of personhood, more than a because also Briseis doesn't really matter as a character in the Iliad. It's her being taken away. That act is what's important about it's what it means for Agamemnon to devalue Achilles. And so we just kind of wanted to sidestep the devaluing of women that sets up. But that's the initial rage. Him dealing with that, the onset of a new in conflict type of rage brought on by Patroclus's death, and his processing of that, his violent outbursts of his murder of Hector, and not only killing Hector on the battlefield in revenge for Patroclus's death, but the desecration of Hector's body after death, and a refusal until the very end of the Iliad, and the very end of our show, to return Hector's body to Priam, his father. And it's about the process of grief and rage. And I think that's also, to go back to why this play now, I think there's a lot of value in examining how we process rage in this particular political climate, because there's a lot to be mad at. There's a lot
Totally.
that's happening that is like really infuriating. It's I speaking for myself, I'm full of rage and at what's happening. I'm full of grief for what I wish the country we lived in was. But those emotions are brought by outside things that are out of my control, and what is in my control is how I process and approach that. And I think there's a lot to learn from the Iliad and from how we approach this new adaptation of the Iliad in our production of Achilles, for how to do that.
Yeah, completely. And like, not to reference another property in this conversation, but like to the overall theme of this journey that he goes on of like turn your weapons to the capital. And like I think that is so poignant in today's, because I've been, I'm living out recently. I think I said that on the last episode. That I'm like plugged into Crooked Media's podcast to like cope with everything that's happening. And like I'm also online, and like I feel like the way that we see people talk about like it is so like devaluing to be like to try and entertain that we should have civil conversations with the other side of this debate, and I remember after the election I was like, I hope they all lose their healthcare. I hope they all suffer, and even if I have to, like, I hope they all like reap what they sowed. And it's so easy to have that initial reaction, and it is very similar to, like, obviously, like in theory it's a lot more violent in the Iliad, but like it, like the idea of like just like so much hatred towards someone else who is on the other side but is also working for the same, is working under the same system you are, just is now your enemy, you know and the conclusion of this adaptation and the conclusion of Iliad's of Achilles' arc in this story is turn your weapons to the capital. And that is so much the arc we need to have in America of like and like it's not saying like be nice to Trump supporters, but it's just remember the humanity in everyone, which I think is a really important moment, even if they've, gone full brain rot on the other side, still a human person. And, I think that that is a really good message to send in this moment.
And I think it's interesting to examine like that like level of wishing malice upon another side coming from the conservatives towards us, because in the Iliad, like, this is going to sound so shallow, and you guys just, I don't mean it like this, but it's not that deep. Like, it was a lot less about like identities and like literally wanting people to die for who they are than it was about like people being used as pawns for trade and sort of livelihood in a different and slightly less personal way. And so when you examine how Hector is treated by Achilles, like during and after his death, and then Priam's reaction to that, we see Priam basically like unravel completely. And I don't know, it's just like we see exactly how far that humanity or that disregard for humanity can get you in terms of like finding yourself in a position very similar to the position that you were so angry at before.
Yeah, exactly. Scary. All right. Well, moving on to a totally different topic, but it is more, I guess, like we can transition under the idea of like the personal themes of this show, like Achilles as a human being and not as a weapon in war. Um, talking a little bit about the romance that is also in the show and is also in this story. I'm sure many of you who are listening to this podcast have heard of a little book called Song of Achilles. We've already mentioned it. So if we want to start off talking about where this show is going to diverge from, we kind of already got into it, but just like expand on it more, like how the romance plays into this show different than it plays into the book that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with.
Yeah, like I Song of Achilles is probably the most well-known contemporary adaptation of the Iliad, which is kind of why we wanted to touch on that in comparison to this, because like I said toward the beginning of this episode, it was a jumping off point for my approach of the piece. Like it is a beautiful piece of literature. It is
I'm
one,
halfway through reading it right now, so
Oh,
I can really
yay!
say it's really great.
Right?
Had a lot of time on the train, blew through a lot of pages.
it's some of the most beautiful prose I've ever read. It
It's
it
stunning.
is one of my favorite books because of that. Even more because of the way it's written than the actual story itself. But Song of Achilles focuses on reclaiming the romance narrative and queer narrative of Achilles and Patroclus as partners, and that is certainly, I think, Song of Achilles laid the groundwork for in contemporary um, pop culture to make it a given that to see Patroclus and Achilles as lovers. And I think I just want to make sure to give that book the credit it deserves for that, because the Iliad has been around for so long. And obviously those themes are fairly textual. They get cremated and their bones buried together. Allegedly remains have been found, like the allegedly, not non-provably, but at very least the location of where they would be is marked geographically. They were buried together in the same urn. That, like, all of that has been around this whole time, but Song of Achilles brought that relationship into pop culture in a way of like uh to put the concept of Achillean love onto a level with like sapphic love, in that like Sappho has always been a clear highlight of female queer love, because a lot of her poems were remaining and overt and remained, but like the idea of Achillean love is a much more contemporary phrasing. Not that like those themes haven't always been around, but that specific terminology is like not even decided on yet, but that conversation was initiated really largely in pop culture spaces due to Song of Achilles, putting this queer romance on a pedestal in that same way, because there are plenty of other queer Greek everything, especially like Ganymede, Hyacinth, Apollo. Like we can keep throwing it. Those are just talking about like men too. Like we can also have the whole female queer love is like a separate conversation that we can't even unpack right now. And what that means, we've had those conversations on this podcast for sure. But that opened the space for, in our adaptation, not to focus on that. Like I said in the beginning, my original draft of this focused on that a lot more. But that's not the interesting contemporary story to tell, because we exist in a different contemporaneous space than even when Song of Achilles was published. While it is still radical to talk about, and becomes more radical every day due to the backsliding of what is acceptable in public culture, it's a really scary time to be a queer person in America. It's a really scary time to be anything that's not a straight white man in America. I can keep listing off the levels of identity that are affected. Everyone is affected to a large point, but like there is still the population of the cis white male majority that is in power is getting scarier, and it's getting scarier to be anyone else. That is all to say, a lot of the work done by Song of Achilles let us approach other themes in our adaptation while focusing, while being able to have that relationship be textual without having to develop it much more beyond what is already in the Iliad.
Right. And I do think the groundwork that Madeline Miller laid in Song of Achilles does also, and frankly, like various texts throughout history, like pre-Song of Achilles, it was all very historians and classicists being like, they're gay, and then everyone else being like, sure. But like, because Madeline Miller did the work to kind of like make it more overt, and also just to bring that outside of like class and, you know, historical spaces, now our adaptation gets to like still maintain that dynamic, but almost have it be like it's taking a back seat almost, which is a huge privilege. Like it's the idea that, so we were prompted to think about, or like we prompted each other, I guess, to think about like Achillean versus Sapphic, like love, and how they're different and so similar in their origins, and also what they kind of represent a lot in like classics. And kind of the thesis of what I think about that is kind of like throughout time, both types of relationships and both types of love like expand on characteristics that each gender, and as of the moment I'm speaking the binary, however, like anyone can kind of resonate with any of this depending on how they were socialized and how they feel social pressures now. Kind of they expand on characteristics that each gender isn't quote unquote supposed to have. So for women, I see it as like independence. Women are not supposed to be independent of men. And that's what's so frequently like voiced in the literary canon about what's so beautiful about being a queer woman, and like, you know, like having men just simply not be in the equation at all is an act of defiance. And we could go down that rabbit hole of like, but if you're thinking about that, then aren't men, and who cares? And then for men, this trait that the gender quote unquote isn't supposed to have is this like softness. And because Madeline Miller really set the groundwork for like expanding on just how much their relationship benefits from that softness, and how it is so, for lack of a better term, like so forever because of how soft they are allowed to be with one another, we are able to use that in our movement sequences. We are able to like focus on softness as a stark contrast to this military hardness in all of the moments we see Achilles and Patroclus interact, or in these flashbacks where we see them fall in love. So like, it's such a privilege to have that with us and maintain it, but not have been the people to necessarily have to do the grunt work to get it to the forefront.
And like to expand on the romance in our adaptation further too, like we're lucky enough to work with a fantastic choreographer, Francesca Parker, who is really brilliant, and who we worked with on our adaptation of Carmilla. And the movement and dance in this piece, because I don't think we've said yet, this is a dance theater piece. So the text is just as integral to the storytelling as dance and movement are, because the Iliad embodied is very physical.
Yeah.
It is the story of war, but it's also the story of this romance, and that tension, like Ava was saying, comes through a lot in the movements and dance sequences built into the piece.
Yeah.
And there's a
I
tension in
also,
the music, that choices behind this too, that like
yeah.
the music in this fluctuates between more like rock, punk, emo kind of music, that like feels contemporaneous to the time we're setting it in, and um the themes of war and that tension there. But there's also a lot softer, like indie rock, ethereal moments, as well, in an attempt to live in both spaces.
Yeah. And I think that those elements to the show make it so much more like, not to be like all theater, especially classic theater, like has to be accessible, but like heightened language is always going to be even a light barrier to some people's understanding of like the themes you're trying to convey in a show. And the movement sequences and the music choices will always help in this show, like really hammer home what we're like talking about, which I think is really cool and really powerful. Yeah. Um, Lovely. That was all of the questions that I wanted to go through, all the sections I wanted to go through. Is there anything else about the adaptation that you guys didn't get to talk about right now that you wanted to talk about?
Okay, last thing. So,
Go for it, girl.
when you were talking about accessibility and like how different sort of like approaches to like physicality and stuff like that like make things more accessible, Brayden shared with me and our choreographer a reference sheet that he created for like inspo for like aesthetics and acting and just like approaches to take. And I went through and I took notes on all the acting clips. And essentially my like what I gleaned from that was like almost like this like 90s 2000s like broy nihilism, like interweaving that with classical text to make the message timeless and accessible, like almost like a brooding like 80s greaser is like asking questions that no one has ever had the answers to. So it's like the ways in which we're going about communicating this like crazy heightened text that like literally like no one could understand all of upon first read completely, given especially the context of it all. Um, but even the approaches to like the acting and the aesthetics and like certain like references to timeliness that we do understand in our generation right now, um, do make it a lot more accessible, because that is also a huge tenet of what the company wants to do.
Yeah, I'm gonna elaborate on both those parts further, because yeah, that is something that we haven't really talked about, is kind of the third aspect to this is the actual staging and like directorial approach that I take as a director, which isn't necessarily in the text, but is how text a script is translated to stage. And a lot of my personal inspiration as a director, and the parts of my personal inspirations as an artist that I'm drawing on for this piece specifically, are a lot of work of Greg Araki, Gus Van Sant, John Waters, these pioneers of new queer cinema, as a genre, and how that like nihilism is a big aspect of that approach. And kind of that wisdom comes from the mouth of babes theory of like, not everyone comes from a positionality of knowing everything, but that it doesn't, anyone can say the profound thing. All of this text, all of this heightened language is being said by a person, with their own experiences and positionality and approach to stuff, that means you're not saying the text like you're being poetic. You're saying the text like you're speaking to someone else, and it happens to be poetic. And a lot of the directors and filmmakers that I'm inspired by have had that approach, and they're also very contemporaneous to the time we're setting this into, just because I just like a lot of movies from the late 90s and early 2000s. So a lot of those happen to be around this time. But like films like My Own Private Idaho, which is a Gus Van Sant film that is my favorite movie, but also a adaptation of Henry IV Part 1. And uses a lot of text from that original piece, but it's Keanu Reeves delivering that, like, I will change what everybody least expects it, and that is the Shakespearean text but delivered in a contemporary way that that becomes a third space. It becomes a third thing that is not the way we're talking now. It is not it's not realistic dialogue. It's never going to be realistic, but it's not heightened language existing in a beyond poetic space. It's a third in between approach to that. And that is a core tenet to the accessibility behind this piece. And like Ava was saying, one of the core tenets in founding this company was our company does classical adaptation. What that means is really, really broad. Classics means a lot of different things. That means a lot of different source texts between oral traditions, written texts, different cultures, countries, time periods, really anything. Anything can be adapted into stage, into real life, into personhood. But these stories that we tell over and over again are told over and over again because there is something in them that still speaks to us, because every time you retell a story, it becomes something new.
Exactly.
And most importantly is making that story understandable and digestible to the people who are in front of you at that moment. Because the Iliad, as it's originally envisioned, speaks so much more. Like, you have to be honest, it speaks more to the people being told it originally than it does to us.
Yeah.
There, like, again, we spent an hour talking about how the themes apply to today, but there are ways to make those themes apply today more.
Yeah.
And there's ways to make those themes that are there and take a while to digest and sit with. And like Ava and I have spent a lot of time in the weeds, in books, in journal articles, in like thinking about theory and thoughts and stuff like that. And like that, all that work is hard and takes a lot of time. We have an audience in front of us for an hour.
Exactly.
And we want to communicate all of those things at once in an hour. We're talking for longer today about this than the actual piece.
Oh my God.
Like that's all of that's going to, the goal is you shouldn't have to listen to this podcast episode about this piece to understand it. That is never our approach to anything like this. We wanted to do this because we wanted to share our perspective of processing all of these thoughts and ideas, and like talk about how much goes into this. But a core tenet of myself as an artist, and that I think we've all agreed on as a company, is that like all the hour of art that you see should speak for itself. I don't believe in director's notes for that reason. I believe in experiencing that piece of art as it is meant to be experienced, and that alone should make it legible.
Period. That is so real. I think that's a great note to close on, honestly. The like what the show's hopefully going to do and what the company hopes to do. Yeah, this has been fun leading this convo. I should do it more often.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. Solidly Brayden's job. But this has been lovely. I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. I feel like we solidly accomplished doing like a good analysis of the Iliad as like a piece of Greek literature and how this adaptation is going to go and like what it pulls from it. Yeah. Amazing. Oh my god, we still got to do the same order though to sign off, or I'm gonna get confused.
I know. Well, that's all for this week, folks. Join us next week where we'll be starting
The Hammer of Thor and reading the first 6 chapters. That's chapters 1 through 6.
Yes, it is. Man, I'm just thinking now of how I guessed that the hammer was going to be involved, and like that was like, the title of the next book. I was like, wow, I'm the smartest person alive. Make sure to follow us on social media. We're at Return to Camp on every platform that matters, and we also have a coffee account and a Redbubble store and a website, www.returntocamp.com, and follow Next Life Theater on Instagram and Facebook at Next Life Theater Co.
And find more information at nextlifetheater.com.
Yes, theater with the R-E, not with the ER.
The right way.
See you next week.
Bye.
See you next week.